The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs, Arizona, as Lillian Chambers ducked behind a water trough, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. She hadn't expected her wedding day to involve bullets. But then again, nothing in her life had gone according to plan since she'd arrived in this frontier town in the spring of 1878. Lillian clutched the tattered remains of her wedding dress, the once pristine white fabric now stained with dust and sweat. The delicate satin ribbon that had adorned her waist hung in tatters, torn when she'd fled from the church after discovering her fiancé's betrayal. The man she'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry had another woman and another life entirely. "Miss, you all right there?" A deep voice called out from behind her. Lillian whipped around to find herself staring into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges of his Stetson. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice betrayed her. "Just caught in some unfortunate crossfire." The man's eyes traveled down to her torn wedding dress and the ribbon hanging limply from her waist. His expression softened. "Zane Blackett," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Town marshal, that there's quite a wedding dress." Though I don't recall hearing about any weddings scheduled for today. Lillian hesitated before taking his hand. "That's because there isn't one, not anymore." Another gunshot rang out and Zane pushed her further behind the water trough, shielding her with his body. "Drunken cowboys," he muttered. "Saturday night troubles starting early." He turned back to her. "You got a name, Miss Lillian Chambers," she replied, suddenly aware of how close he was. She could smell leather and something clean like pine soap. "I arrived on yesterday's stage from Boston." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're Thomas Whitmore's bride," Lillian's face fell. "I was supposed to be, until I discovered he's already married to someone in Tucson." Zane's jaw tightened. "Thomas Whitmore," he spat the name like it tasted bad. "I should have known." Man's got a reputation for spinning tales. The gunfire had ceased, but Lillian remained huddled behind the trough, unsure where to go or what to do. Her trunk of belongings was still at the small hotel where she'd spent the previous night, and she had precisely $12.43 to her name, hardly enough for a ticket back east. "Come on," Zane said, standing and offering his hand again. "Let's get you somewhere safe while I deal with those troublemakers." Lillian took his hand, struggling to stand in her cumbersome dress. As she rose, the torn ribbon caught on the edge of the trough and ripped further. The final threads gave way, and the once beautiful blue satin fluttered to the dusty ground. "Oh!" she cried, reaching for it, but the desert wind snatched it away, carrying it several feet before it landed in a muddy puddle near the saloon. "I'll get it," Zane offered, striding over to retrieve the soiled ribbon. He held it carefully, as though it were something precious rather than a ruined piece of fabric. A group of men stumbled out of the saloon, their laughter cutting through the afternoon air. One of them, a portly man with a greasy beard, pointed at Lillian. "Well, looky here, boys, it's Whitmore's mail order mistake." His cruel laughter was joined by his companions. "Heard you got yourself all the way from Boston just to find out you ain't wanted. That ribbon's in a sorry state, just like your wedding plans." Lillian felt her face flush with humiliation. News traveled fast in small towns, and it seemed her heartbreak was already common knowledge. Zane's expression darkened. He stepped forward, tucking the ribbon into his vest pocket before approaching the men. "That's enough, Hargrove," he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. "Just having a bit of fun, Marshal," Hargrove sneered. "No law against that, is there?" "There's laws against public drunkenness, disturbing the peace, and discharging firearms within town limits, all of which you're guilty of." Zane's hand rested on the pistol at his hip. "Now, how about you boys head on home before I decide to enforce those laws?" The men grumbled but dispersed, casting spiteful glances at Lillian as they went. Zane turned back to her, his expression softening. "Don't mind them. They've got more whiskey than wit in them right now. Lillian tried to smile, but her lips trembled. It seems I've made quite the spectacle of myself. None of this is your doing, Zane said firmly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ribbon. It was soiled and torn, much like her hopes and dreams. To her surprise, he didn't simply hand it back to her. Instead, he pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, dampened it from his canteen, and gently cleaned the mud from the ribbon as best he could. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her waist. Stunned by the unexpected kindness, Lillian nodded. With careful movements that belied his large hands, Zane tied the ribbon around her waist, creating a neat bow that somehow made the tattered dress look intentional rather than ruined. "There," he said, stepping back to assess his work. "Still beautiful." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, perhaps, or something more. "Thank you," Lillian whispered. "Miss Chambers," Zane said, his voice taking on a formal tone, "I know this town hasn't given you the welcome you deserve, but I promise you this. As long as I'm here, you won't face another day like this one." He touched the brim of his hat. "And that's a promise I intend to keep. Forever, if need be." The word forever hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Lillian found herself believing him, despite having learned the hard way that a man's promises could be as empty as the vast Arizona sky. "Now," he continued, offering his arm, "let's find you a safe place to stay while we figure out your next steps." Lillian hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. As they walked down the main street, her ruined wedding dress trailing dust, she felt the strangest sensation, like the closing of one door and the opening of another, far more promising one. The crowd at Martha Holcomb's boarding house fell silent as Zane escorted Lillian through the front door. Martha herself stood at the bottom of the stairs, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Marshal Blackett," she acknowledged, her eyes darting to Lillian. "And Miss Chambers," Lillian supplied, fighting the urge to hide behind Zane as every pair of eyes in the small parlor focused on her wedding dress. "Miss Chambers needs a room, Martha," Zane said, "and some privacy." Martha's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. "Room at the top of the stairs is available." $2 a week, meals included. Lillian's heart sank. Even at that reasonable price, her meager funds wouldn't last long. Zane seemed to read her thoughts. "Put it on my account for now," he said quietly. "No, I couldn't possibly," Lillian began. "Consider it a loan," he interrupted. "Until you get settled." Martha retrieved a key from a hook behind her desk. "Supper's at 6, she said, handing it to Lillian, "and I don't allow gentlemen callers after 8. Her stern gaze softened slightly. "Even if they are the marshal." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "That won't be an issue, Mrs. Holcomb. Got some dresses might fit you too," Martha added, eyeing Lillian's ruined wedding gown. "My daughter left them when she married and moved to California, plain but serviceable." "That's very kind," Lillian said, genuinely touched by the offer. As they climbed the stairs, Zane kept a respectful distance, though Lillian was acutely aware of his presence behind her. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. "It's perfect," Lillian said, meaning it. After the events of the day, the simple room felt like a sanctuary. Zane stood awkwardly in the doorway, reluctant to enter the private space. "I'll have someone bring your things from the hotel." "Thank you," Lillian said, suddenly overwhelmed by his kindness. "For everything." He shook his head. "No need for thanks. What happened to you wasn't right. Still, not many would have helped a stranger the way you have." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Perhaps I don't aim to remain strangers, Miss Chambers." Their eyes locked again, and Lillian felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. Before she could respond, however, he tipped his hat. "Rest now. I'll check on you tomorrow." With that, he descended the stairs, leaving Lillian to wonder what fate had brought her to this dusty frontier town and this unexpectedly gallant marshal. The next morning, Lillian woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and the distant sounds of a town coming to life. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for the familiar comfort of her childhood bed in Boston. Reality rushed back as her hand brushed against the rough wool blanket of the boarding house bed. She sat up, taking inventory of her situation. Her trunk had been delivered as promised, sitting at the foot of her bed. One of Martha's daughters dresses a simple blue calico hung on a hook by the door, and on the small bedside table sat her torn ribbon, neatly folded with a note beneath it. Curious, Lillian picked up the small piece of paper. "Miss Chambers," it read in a surprisingly elegant hand, "I hope you rested well. I've made inquiries about employment opportunities in town. If you're amenable, I'd like to discuss them over lunch. I'll call at noon. Respectfully, Zane Blackett." Lillian found herself smiling. The marshal was certainly efficient. She rose, washed her face in the basin, and changed into the borrowed dress, which fit reasonably well, if a bit loose in the bodice. After a moment's hesitation, she took the blue ribbon and tied it around her hair, transforming it from a symbol of humiliation into something new. At precisely noon, a knock came at her door. Zane stood in the hallway, hat in hand, his dark hair slightly damp as if freshly washed. He'd changed into a clean shirt, and Lillian noticed he'd shaved, the strong line of his jaw more prominent without yesterday's stubble. "Miss Chambers," he greeted her, his eyes taking in the sight of her in the blue dress. "You look well." "As do you, Marshal," she replied, suddenly shy under his gaze. "And please call me Lillian." A smile warmed his features. "Then I'm Zane, just Zane." He escorted her to a small cafe at the end of the main street where the proprietor, a plump woman named Mrs. Garcia, greeted them warmly. Unlike the stares that had followed Lillian yesterday, the cafe owner's welcome seemed genuine. "So," Lillian said once they were seated at a small table by the window, "you mentioned employment opportunities?" Zane nodded, spreading jam on a biscuit. "Several, actually. The school's been without a teacher since Miss Findlay left to get married last spring. Dr. Henderson needs help organizing his records and managing his office. And Mrs. Garcia here," he nodded toward the kitchen, "mentioned she could use another set of hands, especially with the cafe getting busier as more settlers arrive." Lillian blinked in surprise. "You arranged all of this in one morning?" "It's a small town," Zane said with a shrug. "Word travels fast for better or worse." "I see," Lillian murmured, reminded of how quickly news of her failed wedding had spread. As if reading her thoughts, Zane leaned forward. "People will forget about yesterday soon enough. Something new will come along to gossip about. I hope you're right." Lillian sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I did teach for a year in Boston before." She trailed off, not wanting to mention her correspondence with Thomas Whitmore that had led her west under false pretenses. "Before," Zane prompted gently. Lillian sighed. "Before I made the mistake of believing pretty words in letters from a man I'd never met." Zane's expression darkened. "Whitmore has a lot to answer for." "How did you know?" Lillian asked. "About him being married already." "Small town," Zane repeated. "And I make it my business to know about newcomers, especially those with suspicious stories. Whitmore arrived about 6 months ago, set himself up as a businessman, started corresponding with you, I assume, not long after." Lillian nodded. "He presented himself as a successful merchant in need of a wife, said all the right things." She laughed bitterly. "I was so eager to escape my aunt's home after my parents died that I never thought to question his story." "Don't blame yourself," Zane said firmly. "Men like Whitmore are practiced liars." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food-thick stew with chunks of beef and vegetables, served with more of Mrs. Garcia's excellent biscuits. As they ate, Zane told Lillian about Cottonwood Springs, how it had started as a mining town but was growing into a proper settlement, with families putting down roots alongside the prospectors and cowboys. "It's not Boston," he admitted, "but it's a good place. People look out for each other." "Like you looked out for me," Lillian said softly. Their eyes met across the table, and that same indefinable something passed between them again. Zane reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. "I meant what I said yesterday," he told her. "About that promise." Before Lillian could respond, the cafe door burst open and a young boy rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. "Marshal," he cried. "Come quick, there's trouble at the saloon." Zane stood immediately, dropping coins on the table for their meal. "Excuse me, Lillian, duty calls." "Of course," she said, trying to hide her disappointment at the interruption. He paused, looking back at her. "Think about those jobs. Let me know which interests you and I'll make the introductions." With that, he was gone, striding purposefully down the street toward whatever commotion awaited him. Lillian watched him go, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the blue ribbon in her hair. For the first time since arriving in Cottonwood Springs, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Over the next few weeks, Lillian found her footing in Cottonwood Springs. She accepted the position at the schoolhouse, teaching the town's 23 children with a passion that surprised even herself. In the afternoons, she helped Dr. Henderson organize his chaotic records, earning extra money to add to her savings. Slowly but surely, the townspeople began to see her as Lillian Chambers, the schoolteacher, rather than Thomas Whitmore's abandoned bride. And through it all, Zane remained a steady presence. He walked her home from the schoolhouse each afternoon, brought her wildflowers that grew along the creek, and took her on Sunday rides into the surrounding countryside. They discovered shared interests in books and music, and Lillian found herself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in her new life. One evening in late June, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Zane finally asked the question Lillian had been both anticipating and dreading. "You ever think about going back to Boston?" Lillian considered the question carefully. "I did at first," she admitted, "when I felt most humiliated and lost, but now." She turned to look at him, his profile strong against the setting sun. "Now I find I'm exactly where I want to be." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years rather than weeks. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice deeper than usual, "because I can't imagine this town without you in it." Lillian's heart quickened. "Is that so, Marshal Blackett?" "It is," he confirmed, turning to face her fully. His blue eyes reflected the sunset's glow. "Lillian, I know it hasn't been long, and after what happened with Whitmore, you have every reason to be cautious, but I want you to know that my intentions are honorable and my feelings sincere." "Zane," she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. He reached up, gently touching the blue ribbon she still wore in her hair most days. "This ribbon," he said, "when I tied it back for you that day, I made a promise, and I meant every word." "Forever," Lillian murmured, remembering. "Forever," he agreed. "If you'll have me." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the warm glow of the desert sunset. When they parted, Lillian felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, like puzzle pieces finally falling into place. But their newfound happiness was short-lived. The very next day, as Lillian was dismissing her students for lunch, Thomas Whitmore appeared in the schoolhouse doorway. He looked much as she remembered from their brief meeting, upon her arrival handsome in a conventional way, with carefully pomaded hair and an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the frontier town. But now Lillian could see the calculation behind his charming smile, the emptiness in his eyes. "Lillian, my dear," he said, stepping into the classroom as the last child departed, "you're a difficult woman to track down." Lillian stiffened, her hand instinctively going to the ribbon in her hair. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm surprised to see you here." "Come now," he said, moving closer. "Surely we can dispense with such formality after all our correspondence." "Our correspondence was based on lies," Lillian said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You're already married." Whitmore waved a dismissive hand. "A misunderstanding. That situation has been resolved." "Resolved." Lillian echoed, a chill running through her despite the June heat. My wife has returned to her family in the East, he said smoothly. Our marriage is over in all but legal terms. I've come to make things right with you, Lillian, to fulfill my promises. Your promises mean nothing to me now, Lillian said, backing away as he approached. Please leave. Whitmore's charming facade slipped, revealing something harder underneath. You came all this way to marry me, and that's still going to happen. I've invested too much in this arrangement to walk away. Arrangement, Lillian repeated, her back now against her desk. Is that what you call luring a woman across the country with false promises? His hand shot out, gripping her wrist painfully. You'll be my wife, Lillian. I need a respectable woman by my side for my business ventures to succeed in this town. Let go of me, Lillian demanded, struggling to free herself. Not until you agree to come with me, Whitmore hissed, his grip tightening. The schoolhouse door banged open, and Zane stood framed in the entrance, his expression thunderous. I believe the lady asked you to let go, Whitmore. Whitmore's grip loosened in surprise, and Lillian wrenched her wrist free, stepping quickly away from him. Marshal Blackett, Whitmore said, smoothing his jacket. This is a private matter between my fiancé and myself. Ex-fiancé, Lillian corrected firmly, and there's nothing private about your deception, Mr. Whitmore. Zane moved further into the room, positioning himself between Lillian and Whitmore. I'm going to have to ask you to leave town, Whitmore. Now. Whitmore laughed, though there was no humor in it. On what grounds, Marshal? I've broken no laws, fraud, Zane said coldly. Bringing a woman here under false pretenses, and that's just the start. I've been making inquiries about you in Tucson. Seems you left some unhappy business partners there and a wife who's filed charges of abandonment. The color drained from Whitmore's face. You're bluffing. Try me, Zane challenged. His hand rested on his pistol, though he didn't draw it. The stage leaves for Tucson in 20 minutes. I suggest you be on it. For a moment, it seemed Whitmore might argue further. Then, with a final venomous glare at Lillian, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was broken only by Lillian's shaky breath. Zane turned to her immediately, concern etched on his features. Are you hurt? He asked, gently taking her wrist to examine the red marks Whitmore had left. No, Lillian assured him, though she trembled slightly. Just shaken. Zane pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest. The steady beat of his heart calmed her frayed nerves. How did you know to come? She asked after a moment. One of your students, little Sally Jenkins, saw Whitmore enter the schoolhouse. She recognized him from when you first arrived and ran to find me. Zane's arms tightened around her. I should have anticipated he might return. You couldn't have known, Lillian said, pulling back to look up at him, and I'm fine. Really? Zane touched the blue ribbon in her hair, his expression softening. I made a promise to protect you. I aim to keep it. You have, Lillian assured him, reaching up to touch his face. You do. Their kiss this time was different, deeper, more certain, a declaration rather than a question. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zane rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he whispered. Not next month or next year, now, today, Lillian's eyes widened. Today. I almost lost you once, Zane said. I don't want a chance at happening again. I love you, Lillian Chambers. I think I have since I saw you hiding behind that water trough in your wedding dress. Lillian laughed, joy bubbling up inside her like a desert spring. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you today. By sunset, word had spread throughout Cottonwood Springs. The town marshal and the school teacher were to be married, and everyone was invited to witness the ceremony. The townspeople rallied around them, transforming the schoolhouse into a wedding venue in a matter of hours. Mrs. Garcia provided a feast, Dr. Henderson brought his fiddle for dancing, and Martha Holcomb surprised Lillian with a beautiful cream-colored dress that had belonged to her grandmother. It's been waiting for the right bride, Martha said gruffly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright as she helped Lillian dress. As the final touch, Lillian tied the blue ribbon around her waist, the same ribbon Zane had rescued and retied that first day. What had once been a symbol of humiliation had become something precious, a tangible reminder of promises made and kept. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. As the setting sun painted the desert gold once more, Lillian and Zane exchanged vows before Reverend Parker and the entire town. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Zane kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "Forever," he whispered against her lips. "Forever," she agreed. The celebration continued late into the night, with dancing and laughter filling the schoolhouse. Even those who had mocked Lillian that first day, including the now sober Hargrove, came to offer congratulations and apologies. As Zane led her in a dance beneath lantern light, Lillian marveled at how much her life had changed in just one short month. "Happy?" Zane asked, his arms secure around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Lillian admitted. "When I arrived here, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Later, as they walked hand in hand to the small house, Zane had been preparing as a surprise. "A marshal's salary isn't much. But it's enough for a home of our own." Lillian couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Blackett?" Zane asked, the new name sending a thrill through her. "About ribbons," she replied honestly, "and promises, and how sometimes what seems like the worst day of your life can lead to the very best." Zane stopped, turning to face her beneath the starlit sky. "I meant what I said that day, Lillian, and I mean it now, forever." As his lips met hers once more, Lillian knew without doubt that this was where she belonged, not in Boston, not with Thomas Whitmore, but here in this dusty frontier town, with this honorable man who had tied back her ribbon and promised forever. And as the years passed, that promise held true. Lillian and Zane built a life together in Cottonwood Springs, welcoming 2 children, a daughter with Zane's blue eyes and a son with Lillian's quiet determination. The town grew and prospered, and Lillian continued teaching, eventually becoming the principal of a proper school building with 3 classrooms and a bell tower. Zane served as marshal for 20 more years before retiring to focus on the small ranch they'd acquired outside town. Through it all, they remained as devoted to each other as they had been on that June evening when they exchanged their vows. And each year on their anniversary, Zane would present Lillian with a blue ribbon, a simple tradition that never failed to bring tears to her eyes and warmth to her heart. For in that ribbon was the story of their beginning, of a promise made and kept, of forever. On their 30th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Zane took Lillian's hand, his touch still sending the same thrill through her after all these years. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming west to marry a man who wasn't worthy of you?" Lillian smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "How could I regret the journey that led me to you?" Zane kissed her temple, his arm secure around her waist where another blue ribbon was tied. "I thank God every day for bringing you to that water trough, Lillian Blackett." "As do I," she murmured. "As do I." Together they watched the sunset paint the desert gold just as it had on their wedding day. And in the gentle breeze that stirred Lillian's now silver hair, there whispered the echo of a promise made long ago and kept faithfully forever.